My father looked me in the eye and said he preferred a new boat to a son with two legs. When I begged for $20,000 to save my limb from amputation, he sipped his vintage champagne and told me that a limp would teach me fiscal responsibility. My sister even laughed and filmed my desperation for her social media followers, calling it tragic content. They thought I was finished, just another broken piece of the family to be discarded. They had no idea that my brother Lucas, the one they mocked for being a blue-collar worker, would sell his entire livelihood to save me. And they certainly did not know that 2 years later, I would be the one holding the deed to their precious yacht and the mortgage on their mansion. My name is Ethan, and at 34 years old, I learned the hard way that toxic family members are like gangrene. Sometimes you have to cut them off to survive. I was always the responsible one, the landscape architect who tried to build a solid life on shaky ground. Before I tell you how I legally seized my parents' assets, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to rely on the person everyone else underestimated. It started on a Tuesday that felt like any other. I was conducting a site survey for a high-end cliffside villa project in Malibu. The client wanted a terraced garden on a slope that frankly should not have been built on. I remember checking the soil density one moment, and the next the world tilted. The ground beneath my boots disintegrated. I fell 40 feet sliding down jagged shale until I hit the ravine floor. The pain was not immediate. It was a cold shock, first followed by the terrifying realization that a boulder the size of a compact car had pinned my right leg against the canyon wall. The sound of my own bone snapping echoed louder than the landslide. By the time the rescue team airlifted me to the trauma center, my leg was a mangled mess of crushed tissue and splintered bone. I woke up in the emergency room to the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the sterile smell of antiseptic. A tall man with graying hair, Dr. Evans, stood over me holding a clipboard. He did not look optimistic. He told me the damage was catastrophic but not hopeless. There was a specialized limb salvage procedure involving vascular reconstruction and bone grafting that could save my leg. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. Dr. Evans hesitated, his eyes shifting from my leg to the paperwork. He explained that because the trauma occurred during a contract job and involved specialized reconstruction, my insurance had flagged the specific salvage surgery as elective and out-of-network. They would cover a standard below-knee amputation, but if I wanted to keep my leg, I needed to cover the deductible and the specialist fees up front. The cost was $20,000, and I had exactly 24 hours to secure the funds before the tissue damage became irreversible. My heart sank. I had just drained my savings to put a down payment on a small condo closer to work. I had less than $500 in my checking account. I lay there trapped in a hospital bed, realizing that the price of my mobility was the exact amount my father spent on his country club membership fees. I asked the nurse to hand me my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed my father's number. I thought that in a life or death situation, their vanity would vanish. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. My fingers slipped on the screen as I dialed my father, Richard. The pain was a living thing now, clawing up my thigh despite the initial dose of morphine the nurses had administered. I needed to hear his voice. I needed him to tell me it would be handled. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. I could hear the distinct murmur of a crowd in the background, the clinking of crystal in soft jazz. It was a world away from the blood and antiseptic stench of the emergency room. Dad. I managed to choke out, my voice thick with shock. I am at the hospital. There was an accident at the site. My leg is crushed. There was a pause, but not of concern. It was the pause of a man interrupted during a toast. Ethan, really? He sighed, his tone dripping with impatience. We are in the middle of the tasting for the new Cellar collection. Is this absolutely urgent, or can it wait until tomorrow morning? My breath hitched. Urgent. I was looking at my own exposed bone. Dad, they need $20,000 to save the leg. Insurance will not cover the reconstruction. I need a transfer. Please. 20,000, he repeated, not with shock but with annoyance. Do not be dramatic, Ethan. We just bought the boat. Cash flow is tight. Figure it out. Call your mother if you must, but do not ruin her evening either. The line went dead. He had hung up. He had actually hung up. I stared at the phone, disbelief warring with the agony radiating from my shin. I dialed my mother, Patricia, next. She answered on the first ring, but before I could get a word out, a siren wailed from an ambulance pulling into the bay just outside my window. "Oh my God, Ethan," she snapped immediately. "What is that racket? It is piercing my eardrums. I have a migraine coming on and you are assaulting me with noise." "Mom, I am in the ER." I pleaded, tears finally leaking from my eyes. Not from pain, but from the sheer coldness of it all. "I am hurt bad. Dad said no. I need help." "Well, I cannot hear a word you are saying over that screeching," she said, her voice icy. "Call me back when you are in a quiet room and have composed yourself. It is incredibly rude to scream into the phone." She disconnected. I sat there, the silence of the phone louder than the chaos of the ER. They did not care. To them, my emergency was just a noise complaint, a disruption to their wine tasting. Dr. Evans walked back in, looking at the clock. "Ethan, we are losing the window. Have you secured the funds?" I looked at him, then at my leg. I knew I could not convince them over the phone. They needed to see the blood. They needed to see their son broken in front of their wealthy friends. Their vanity was the only leverage I had left. "I need to leave," I said, sitting up. The room spun violently. "You cannot leave," Dr. Evans said, stepping forward. "You are in critical condition. If you move that leg, you could sever an artery. I need the discharge papers." I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I am signing out against medical advice. Give me the strongest painkiller you can legally prescribe and call me a taxi." It took 20 minutes of arguing, but eventually I signed the waiver that absolved the hospital of liability if I died on the street. The nurse injected me with a high dose of hydromorphone and helped me into a wheelchair. I dragged myself into the back of a cab, my leg wrapped in temporary splints and bandages. "To the Hamptons," I told the driver. He looked at me in the rearview mirror, eyeing the blood seeping through the gauze. "Buddy, that is a 2-hour ride." "You sure, just drive," I whispered, leaning my head against the cold glass. Every bump in the road felt like a knife twisting in my marrow. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the resolve hardening in my chest. I was going to crash their party. I was going to bleed on their expensive Persian rugs. And I was going to make them look me in the eye and tell me my leg was worth less than their new boat. The taxi driver hesitated at the imposing iron gates of the estate. He looked at the blood soaking through my bandages, and then at the pristine driveway lined with imported Italian cypress trees. "Are you sure this is the place?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded and handed him the last of my cash. I did not have the energy to explain that the people living inside this fortress of wealth were the same ones who had hung up on me an hour ago. I dragged myself out of the car. The sea breeze hitting my face should have been refreshing, but it only made me shiver uncontrollably from the shock. I adjusted the temporary crutches the hospital had given me. Every step up the marble walkway was a fresh sentence of torture. My right leg felt like it was on fire, a throbbing reminder that the clock was ticking. Through the sheer floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the silhouette of a life I was never really part of. Golden light spilled out onto the lawn. I could hear jazz music and the performative laughter of the ultra-wealthy. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors. The foyer was filled with the scent of expensive lilies and beeswax. I stood there, a specter of tragedy interrupting their comedy. My work boots were caked in mud from the landslide. My jeans were ripped and stained dark with dried blood. My face was gray and covered in grit. The chatter in the living room died down instantly. It started from the entrance and rippled outward until the only sound was the clinking of a silver spoon against a glass. 20 faces turned to look at me. These were my parents' friends, investors, and local socialites. They looked at me with a mixture of horror and distaste, as if a stray dog had wandered in from the rain. My sister Brittany was the first to break the silence. She was standing near the grand piano, holding her phone up, the ring light attached to it blindingly bright. She was in the middle of a live stream. She lowered the phone slightly, but I noticed she did not stop recording. Her face twisted not in concern, but in disgust. "Ethan, what on earth are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice shrill. "Look at your boots. You are tracking mud all over Mom's antique Persian rug. Do you have any idea how much it costs to clean that?" She turned the camera toward me, narrating to her invisible audience. You guys, I cannot believe this. My brother just crashed our celebration looking like a zombie. This is literally so embarrassing. I ignored her and focused on the center of the room. My father, Richard, stood by the fireplace. He was holding a magnum bottle of Dom Perignon. My mother, Patricia, was next to him, wearing a silver gown that probably cost more than my car. They looked picture perfect. Richard froze, his hand still gripping the neck of the champagne bottle. He did not rush to me. He did not ask if I was okay. He looked at the guests, then at me, his jaw tightening. I told you to handle this quietly, Richard hissed, his voice low, but carrying across the silent room. We are entertaining, Ethan. Look at you. You are making a scene. I am losing my leg, Dad, I said, my voice cracking. I need the money. Now. Pop. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Richard had popped the cork. Frothy vintage champagne spilled over his hand, dripping onto the floor. He poured a glass calmly, deliberately avoiding my gaze. We are celebrating Ethan, he said, handing the glass to a stunned guest. Do not spoil the mood with your drama. We can discuss your little accident in the kitchen. Not here, not now. My mother stepped forward, her heels clicking on the floor. She smiled apologetically at the guests, before turning a glare on me that could freeze water. You heard your father? She whispered, grabbing my arm right above the IV bruise. The kitchen. Now. And try not to bleed on anything else on your way out. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced myself to look my father in the eye. The pain in my leg was a dull, throbbing roar, now a constant reminder that my time was running out. Dad. I am not asking for a handout, I said, my voice trembling slightly, despite my best efforts to sound composed. I am asking for a loan. $20,000. I will sign a promissory note right now. I will pay you back with interest. 5%, 10%, whatever you want. I just need to keep my leg. The room went quiet again, but this time it was not out of shock. It was the awkward silence of people watching a beggar plead. Richard swirled the champagne in his glass, the bubbles catching the light of the crystal chandelier. He chuckled, a low, dry sound that had no warmth in it. He walked past me, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the metallic tang of my blood, and motioned toward the French doors that opened onto the expansive patio and the private dock beyond. Come here, Ethan, he said, gesturing with his glass. Dragging my crushed limb across the polished floor, I followed his gaze. Illuminated by underwater LEDs, and the moonlight was a sleek, massive vessel bobbing gently in the water. It was pristine white with chrome accents that gleamed in the night. Do you see that? Richard asked, his voice swelling with pride. That is the Sea Ray 500. Just signed the papers this afternoon. She is a beauty, is she not? I stared at the boat, confusion clouding my mind. I do not understand, I whispered. Read the name on the stern, he commanded. I squinted through the pane. There, in gold leaf lettering, were the words, The Golden Brittany. We bought it to celebrate your sister reaching 100,000 followers. Richard continued, turning back to face me with a look of utter satisfaction. And honestly, Ethan boats of that caliber require liquidity. Serious liquidity. He took a sip of his wine, savoring it, while I stood there leaning on my crutches, barely holding myself up. So when you ask for $20,000 right now, you are asking for money that simply is not liquid, he explained, as if he were teaching a child about basic economics. I poured every available dime of cash into that down payment and the slip fees. My hands are tied. You just bought a $500,000 yacht, I said, the realization crashing down on me harder than the rocks had earlier. And you are telling me you cannot spare the cost of a used sedan to save my leg? Richard shrugged, adjusting his silk tie. Timing is everything in life, Ethan. You chose to have your accident on the day I made a major asset acquisition. That is simply bad luck, not my emergency. Besides, he patted my shoulder, his touch light and dismissive. Priorities are priorities. We have plans for the summer, and that boat is the centerpiece. I cannot just reverse a wire transfer because you were clumsy at work. My mother stepped out from behind Richard, her face composed into a mask of disappointed elegance. She looked down at my shattered leg, not with the horror of a parent, but with the critical eye of an interior designer spotting a flaw in the upholstery. She took a sip of her champagne, the condensation on the glass dripping onto her manicured fingers. Ethan, please stop looking at us like we are the villains in your little melodrama, she said, her voice dropping to that patronizing register she reserved for service staff and me. This is exactly what I warned you about 10 years ago. I told you that landscape architecture was just a glorified term for digging in the dirt. She gestured vaguely at my muddy boots, her nose wrinkling slightly. If you had listened to me and taken that position at the bank with your Uncle Charles, you would be sitting in a climate-controlled office right now. You would have a platinum insurance plan. You would not be begging on our doorstep covered in filth. Mom, I whispered, clutching the crutches so hard my knuckles turned white. I am a partner at my firm. It was a freak landslide. Being a banker would not have stopped a rock from falling. She waved her hand dismissively, cutting me off. Details do not matter, Ethan. Choices matter. You chose a high-risk, low-reward lifestyle, and now you expect us to liquidate our happiness to pay for your poor planning. She took a step closer, lowering her voice, so the guests nearby would not hear the cruelty, only the tone of maternal concern. Richard and I have discussed this. We are not going to enable you anymore. A limp will teach you responsibility. Every time you take a step, you will be reminded that you need to prioritize your financial health over your artistic whims. I stared at her, the room spinning. Enable me, I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. I paid for my own college tuition. I bought my own used car. I paid for my own apartment. I have never asked you for a single cent since I turned 18. This is the first time I have ever asked for help. Patricia sighed, shaking her head as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum. Do not rewrite history, Ethan. We gave you life. We gave you a childhood in this beautiful home. And now you want $20,000 on a Tuesday night? We simply cannot keep rescuing you from the consequences of your own mediocrity. It is time you grew up. She turned to Brittany, who was still filming. Brittany nodded in agreement, whispering to her phone that tough love is the hardest kind of love. My mother looked back at me one last time, her eyes cold and final. Now please leave. The valet will call you a taxi. Do not make us call security. It would be such a waste of a good party. Brittany did not miss a beat. She stepped into my personal space, the ring light attached to her phone blinding me as I leaned heavily against the wall for support. My body was beginning to shut down. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold clamminess of shock. I was trembling violently, sweat beading on my forehead, but to my sister, this was not a medical emergency. It was content. She angled the camera to capture my pale face and the blood seeping through the bandages on my shin. Okay, guys, look at this. She narrated, her voice dripping with fake sympathy that barely masked her amusement. This is what happens when you do not manifest success. My brother is 34 years old, and he is literally shaking because he has to ask mom and dad for money. It is giving major failure vibes. Hashtag adulting is hard. Hashtag fail. She laughed, a cruel bubbling sound, and zoomed in on my shaking hands. I tried to swat the phone away, but I was too weak. I lost my balance and slid down the wall, hitting the marble floor with a sickening thud. A gasp rippled through the room, but nobody moved to help. They just stared, clutching their crystal flutes, horrified by the unsightly display of weakness in their sanctuary of wealth. Richard finally snapped. He set his glass down on the mantelpiece with a sharp click. "That is enough," he barked. Not at Brittany for her cruelty, but at me for my existence. He signaled to the 2 private security guards standing by the entrance. "Gentlemen, please escort my son to the gate. He is upsetting the guests and ruining the ambiance." "Dad, wait!" I wheezed, trying to push myself up. "Get him out!" Richard ordered, turning his back to me to apologize to a woman in pearls who looked faintly nauseated. "I am so sorry, everyone. We tried to help him, but some people just refuse to help themselves. Please, more champagne. The catering staff will bring out the hors d'oeuvres shortly." The security guards were large men in ill-fitting black suits. They did not speak. They simply grabbed me under the arms. One of them kicked my crutches across the floor. Pain exploded in my leg as they hauled me up my injured limb, dragging uselessly against the polished floor. I looked at my mother one last time. She was checking her reflection in a hallway mirror, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle in her dress. She did not look back. The guards dragged me through the heavy oak doors, across the patio and down the long driveway. Every bump was agony. When we reached the iron gates, they did not gently set me down. They swung the pedestrian gate open and shoved me forward. I stumbled and fell onto the cold asphalt of the public road, scraping my hands and jarring my shattered leg. The gate clanged shut behind me with a finality that echoed in the night air. Through the bars, I could see the warm glow of the house and the silhouette of my family returning to their party. I lay there in the dirt, humiliated, broken, listening to the distant sound of laughter and jazz, while the ocean wind bit into my skin. I had never felt more alone in my life. I closed my eyes and waited for the darkness to take me. 50 meters below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, the only reality is pressure and darkness. I was finishing a hyperbaric weld on a structural support for an oil rig, the blue arc of my torch, the only light in the abyss. My name is Lucas, and unlike my brother Ethan, who builds gardens, or my parents who build facades, I build things that keep people from dying in the deep. I was used to danger. I was used to the terrifying silence of the ocean. But nothing prepared me for the voicemail I received the moment I depressurized and surfaced. I sat on the deck of the support vessel, my hands still shaking from the nitrogen off-gassing, and listened to Ethan. His voice was not the steady, calm tone I knew. It was broken, ragged, and terrified. He spoke of the accident, the $20,000 ransom for his leg, and the silence from our parents. He did not say they refused him, but I knew. I knew Richard and Patricia better than anyone. If it did not look good on a Christmas card, they did not want to pay for it. I did not shower. I did not change out of my work clothes, which smelled of ozone, diesel, and dried salt. I jumped into my 10-year-old Ford F350, the suspension groaning under the weight of my welding rig in the bed. I drove the coastal highway at 90 miles an hour, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I called Ethan back 3 times, but it went straight to voicemail. The fear in my gut was colder than the ocean floor. When I burst through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, people scattered. I must have looked like a maniac, a large man covered in grime, smelling like an oil slick with eyes wild with panic. I scanned the room expecting to see my brother in a trauma bay surrounded by doctors. Instead, I saw a wheelchair parked near the vending machines in the hallway. Ethan was slumped over his head, resting against the cold wall. His face was the color of ash. A temporary splint was wrapped around his leg, but blood had soaked through the layers, dripping onto the linoleum floor. He looked like discarded luggage. I ran to him, dropping to my knees. "Ethan!" I shouted, grabbing his shoulder. He blinked slowly, his eyes unfocused. "Lucas!" He whispered, his lips dry and cracked. "They bought a boat. They chose the boat." A fury unlike anything I had ever felt detonated in my chest. I stood up and marched to the reception desk. The nurse looked up, startled by my imposing frame and the sheer intensity of my rage. Why is my brother rotting in a hallway? I slammed my hand on the counter, making the computer monitors jump. "He has a crush injury. He needs surgery. Now." The nurse stammered, intimidated, but pointing to a screen. "Sir, we cannot proceed with the limb salvage protocol without the deductible payment. We are preparing to transfer him for a standard amputation once he is stable. It is policy." "Policy!" I roared, my voice echoing off the sterile walls. "You are going to cut off his leg because of a bank transfer. He is an architect. That leg is his life. Get the surgeon. Get the administrator. I do not care who you get, but if you do not get someone here in 30 seconds, I am going to tear this desk apart with my bare hands." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, my thumb hovering over the screen. The number stared back at me in harsh green pixels. $4,212. It was good money for a single guy living in a trailer, but against a $20,000 medical ransom, it was nothing. I looked through the glass of the waiting room doors. Ethan was pale, his eyes closed, his chest rising in shallow, ragged breaths. Time was not just running out. It was already gone. I walked out to the parking lot, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me with a hiss. The night air was heavy with humidity. I looked at my truck. It was a matte black Ford F350 lifted with a custom suspension I had installed myself over 3 weekends. In the bed sat my Miller Big Blue welder, a beast of a machine that could fuse steel in a hurricane. That truck and that rig were not just possessions. They were my identity. They were my freedom. They were the only reason I could demand $200 an hour on a rig. Without them, I was just another guy with a strong back and no future. I dialed a number I had saved years ago but hoped never to use. Rusty. He was a liquidator who bought heavy equipment for pennies on the dollar and sold it overseas. He answered on the second ring, his voice sounding like gravel in a mixer. "I need to sell the rig," I said, cutting straight to the point. "The truck, the welder, all the tools in the side boxes. Tonight. Cash." Rusty laughed, a wet hacking sound. "It is 10 at night, Lucas. You in trouble with the law. I am at the hospital," I said, my voice flat. "Do you want it or not? Meet me at the shop in 20 minutes. I drove to his scrapyard on the edge of town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. Every mile felt like I was driving to my own execution. When I pulled into the yard, Rusty was waiting under the buzzing sodium light, chewing on a toothpick. He walked around the truck, kicking the tires, running his hand over the welding unit. He knew what he was looking at. He knew this setup was worth $50,000 easily. $22,000, Rusty said, spitting on the ground. "For everything. Truck welder and whatever is in those boxes. It is worth double," that I said, my jaw tightening. "Not at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, it is not." Rusty shrugged. "Take it or leave it." I looked at the truck one last time. I thought about the road trips, the jobs, the nights I slept in the cab to save on motels. Then I thought about Ethan, the only person in our family who never looked down on me for having dirt under my fingernails. "Done," I said. Rusty went into his office and came back with a thick envelope. He counted the bills on the hood of the truck. 22,000. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the keys. My hand was shaking. A violent, uncontrollable tremor that started in my fingers and ran up my arm. It was not fear. It was the physical reaction of severing a limb. I was handing over my livelihood. I was voluntarily becoming the loser my parents always said I was. I dropped the keys into Rusty's calloused palm. The metal clinking together sounded like a prison door slamming shut. "Pleasure doing business." Rusty smirked. I did not answer. I grabbed the envelope of cash, shoved it into my jacket, and turned around. I walked out of the gate without looking back, my boots crunching on the gravel. I had no ride. I had no job. But I had the money. I started running back toward the hospital, the envelope heavy against my chest, my eyes burning but focused. I was coming, Ethan. I burst through the automatic doors, my chest heaving like a bellows, sweat stinging my eyes. The reception area was quieter now, the late-night lull settling in, but the silence shattered the moment I reached the desk. The head nurse looked up, her expression shifting from annoyance to shock as she recognized me. She started to say something about visiting hours, but I did not give her the chance. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick, grimy manila envelope. With a single motion, I upended it over the pristine white counter. Hundreds of bills smelling of diesel, stale tobacco, and hard labor spilled out in a chaotic green pile. Some fluttered to the floor, but I did not care. $22,000, I announced, my voice hoarse but steady. Cash. Unmarked. Count it. The nurse stared at the mountain of currency, then at my grease-stained face. "Sir, we cannot just accept." "You said it was a money issue." I cut her off, leaning over the counter, my eyes locking onto hers. "You said policy required payment. Here is the payment. Now get Dr. Evans down here and prep the operating room before I tear this place apart." She did not argue. She scrambled for the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. Within minutes, the energy in the hallway shifted from stagnation to urgent action. Dr. Evans appeared from the elevator, looking surprised but relieved. He took one look at the cash on the counter and nodded at me. "Get him to OR." "3," he barked at the orderlies. "Stat." They unlocked the wheels of Ethan's gurney. I ran alongside it as they pushed him down the corridor. He was barely conscious, his skin clammy and gray, his eyes rolling back in his head. He looked up at me, fighting through the fog of pain and medication. "Lucas," he mumbled, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "You did not. Tell me you did not sell." I gripped his hand, ignoring the dirt transferring from my skin to his clean hospital gown. "It is handled, Ethan," I lied, forcing a smile. "I had some savings. Do not worry about it. Just wake up with 2 legs. You have got gardens to build." The double doors to the sterile zone swung shut, cutting me off. The red light above the frame flickered on. Surgery in progress. I stood there for a long time staring at that light, the only bright thing in my world. The adrenaline that had fueled me for the last hour evaporated instantly, leaving behind a crushing weight. My legs gave out. I slid down the wall until I hit the cold linoleum floor, burying my face in my hands. The silence of the hospital hallway pressed in on me. I reached into my pocket out of habit to check for my truck keys, but my fingers brushed against empty fabric. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My Ford F350 was gone. My Miller welder was gone. My tools collected over 10 years of blood and sweat were gone. I was stranded in a hospital waiting room 30 miles from home, with no vehicle, no job, and $12 in my pocket. I looked down at my work boots, battered and scarred from the oil rig. I could hear my mother's voice in my head calling me a failure, a blue-collar disappointment, who would never amount to anything. Technically, she was right. I was now a 30-year-old man with nothing to his name. But then I looked up at the red light again. My brother was going to walk. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the wall. I was broke, stranded, and unemployed. But for the first time in my life, I felt like the richest man in the world. The red light above the operating room doors hummed with a low, menacing buzz. It was the only thing I could look at. If I looked down at my empty hands, I would remember that I had just sold my entire future for a stack of cash that was now gone. If I looked at the clock, I would realize that my brother had been under the knife for 3 hours. The adrenaline that had carried me through the sale of my truck was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. I needed to tell them. It was a reflex, a phantom limb of childhood obedience. I pulled out my cracked smartphone and dialed the home line. My mother Patricia answered on the third ring. The jazz music was gone. The party was over. "He is in surgery," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "The doctors say they can save the leg." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the clink of ice against glass. "And how exactly is that being paid for?" she asked, her tone sharp and accusatory. "We made our position very clear, Lucas. We are not covering it." "I paid for it," I said. A scoff echoed down the line. You live in a trailer park. Do not lie to me." "I sold the truck," I whispered, closing my eyes. "I sold the rig, the tools, everything." Silence. Then a laugh. A cold, incredulous laugh that made my stomach turn. "You sold your truck? The only thing that makes you employable?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. "You are even stupider than I thought. So let me get this straight. Ethan is crippled, and now you are unemployed. You have managed to turn one tragedy into 2 disasters in a single night." "Mom, I saved his leg," I argued, my grip on the phone tightening. "You created 2 burdens," she corrected me. "Do not think you can come crawling back to the guest house when you cannot make rent next month. We just bought a yacht, Lucas. We are not running a shelter for failed sons. You have made your bed. Now you can sleep in it, assuming you can still afford a bed." She hung up. The dial tone droned in my ear, a flat note of rejection. I lowered the phone, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. I was $22,000 lighter, and an infinite amount lonelier. Before I could pocket the phone, it vibrated violently in my hand. A notification from the Miller Family Connect group chat popped up. My stomach dropped as I read the preview. It was from Brittany. I opened the chat. There was a photo of me from high school looking dirty in my shop class coveralls. Beneath it, Brittany had written a message to all our aunts, uncles, and cousins. "Family alert. Just so everyone knows, Lucas just had a mental breakdown and sold all his assets to pay for Ethan's surgery that Dad specifically advised against. He is officially broke and jobless. If he calls asking for emergency loans to pay his rent, please ignore him. We need to teach him that impulsive decisions have consequences. Love you all." I watched as the heart reactions started rolling in from my relatives, a thumbs up from Uncle Charles, a crying laughing emoji from a cousin. They were not just watching us drown, they were taking bets on how long we could hold our breath. I did not type a reply. I did not leave the group. I simply turned the phone off and placed it on the empty plastic chair next to me. I looked back up at the red light. The surgery was still in progress. The world outside those doors had rejected us, stripped us, and mocked us. But inside that operating room was the only person who mattered. I sat alone in the sterile hallway, broke and exhausted, but for the first time I knew exactly who my enemy was. And I knew that when Ethan woke up, we were going to go to war. The 6 months of recovery were a blur of physical agony and crushing poverty. We moved into a basement apartment on the outskirts of the city because it was the only place that did not require a credit check. The walls were paper thin and the dampness seeped into my healing bones, creating a constant throbbing ache around the titanium rods now holding my tibia together. But the physical pain was insignificant compared to the guilt that ate at me every time I looked at Lucas. My brother, a highly specialized underwater welder who used to command $200 an hour, was now working the graveyard shift at a distribution warehouse. Without his truck and his rig, he was stripped of his status. To the world, he was just another unskilled laborer. He would stumble through the door at 6 in the morning, his eyes bloodshot, his back spasming from lifting heavy boxes for 10 hours straight. He never complained. He would simply toss a packet of instant noodles on the cracked laminate counter and joke that we were eating minimalist cuisine. One rainy Tuesday, I watched him fall asleep sitting upright at the kitchen table, a half-eaten bowl of broth in front of him. His hands, which were steady enough to weld pipelines at crush depth, were covered in paper cuts and blisters from handling cardboard. I looked at those hands and felt a rage so pure it almost blinded me. My parents were likely sleeping on Egyptian cotton sheets aboard the Golden Brittany, probably docked in some picturesque marina, while the son who had sacrificed his entire livelihood to save me was passing out from exhaustion in a roach-infested kitchen. That anger became my fuel. It replaced the painkillers I refused to take because they fogged my mind. I needed to be sharp. My leg was useless for now, encased in a brace, but my mind was still the instrument that had graduated top of my class. I pulled out my old laptop. The battery was dying and the screen flickered, but it still ran my architectural software. I began to work. I did not look for small residential jobs. I aimed for the jugular. I started designing a massive proposal for the city's new riverfront revitalization contest. I called it the Resilience Project. I poured every ounce of my trauma, my pain, and my gratitude for Lucas into the blueprints. I designed terraced gardens that used deep-rooted native plants to stabilize eroding banks, a direct metaphor for how Lucas had held me together when my world collapsed. I worked 20 hours a day. When the pain in my leg became unbearable, I would look at my sleeping brother, and I would force my fingers to keep moving across the trackpad. I was not just designing a park, I was building a weapon. I swore to myself that I would not just survive this. I was going to succeed so violently that my parents' wealth would look like pocket change. I was done being the victim. I was becoming the architect of their regret. The ancient cooling fan of my laptop sounded like a jet engine preparing for takeoff in our cramped kitchen. It was the only sound in the apartment besides Lucas's rhythmic breathing from the mattress on the floor. While my brother broke his back lifting boxes at the warehouse, I channeled every ounce of my frustration into the screen in front of me. I was not just drawing a park, I was designing a fortress of nature. I called it the Resilience Project. It was a proposal for the city's derelict riverfront, transforming a flood-prone industrial wasteland into a self-sustaining ecosystem. Every line I drew was a metaphor for our survival. I designed retaining walls that looked like natural rock formations, but were reinforced with titanium just like my leg. I created flood channels that could absorb the violent surges of the river just like Lucas absorbed the cruelty of our parents. When the final render was complete, it was breathtaking, a sanctuary born from disaster. I saved the file, but I did not put my name on it. If the judges saw the name Ethan, they might associate it with the family that had publicly washed their hands of me. I submitted it under a pseudonym, Phoenix Design, and hit send at 3 in the morning. I had no money for the entry fee, so I used the last $20 remaining on a prepaid debit card Lucas had found in his old jacket pocket. While I was building a future on a cracked screen, the first cracks were appearing in my sister's perfect world. Dion, my brother-in-law, was a corporate shark, but he was not a monster. He had watched quietly as his wife and in-laws erased us from their lives. The guilt had started to gnaw at him during a business lunch when a client asked about his wife's brothers. Dion realized he did not know if we were even eating. That afternoon, he ordered a premium hamper of organic fruits, cheeses, and smoked meats. It cost $300 pocket change for him, but a lifeline for us. He had it delivered to his house first, intending to drive it over to our basement apartment personally. But he made the mistake of leaving it on the kitchen island. When he came home, the hamper was gone. He found Brittany in the kitchen scrolling through her phone. "Where is the basket?" Dion asked. Brittany did not even look up. "Oh, that thing I saw the card you wrote. To Ethan and Lucas." "Seriously, Dion, I threw it in the trash." Dion froze. "You threw away food?" "They are starving, Brittany." She laughed a harsh sound. "They are on a journey of self-discovery. If you feed the bears, they never learn to hunt. Besides, it clashed with the kitchen aesthetic." Dion walked to the trash compactor. He heard the crunch of glass jars and the squelch of expensive pears. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and for the first time he did not see a beauty queen. He saw a parasite. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply grabbed his keys, drove to the grocery store, and bought double the amount of food. He drove to our apartment at midnight, leaving the boxes at our door, ringing the bell once, and vanishing into the dark before we could see his face. When Lucas opened the door and found fresh apples, bread, and rotisserie chicken, he wept. We thought it was a miracle. We did not know it was the first act of treason in the house of our enemies. The email that changed our lives arrived at 4:13 in the morning on a Tuesday. It was from the City Urban Development Council, copied to a major green tech venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. My hands shook as I woke Lucas up. I did not just win the design competition for the Resilience Project. The investors were so impressed by the self-sustaining flood control systems that they were offering a $2 million seed round to turn the concept into a dedicated firm. Lucas sat up on his mattress, rubbing sleep from his eyes, looking at the number on the screen with disbelief. "Is that a typo?" he asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. "It is not a typo," I said, feeling the first real smile in 2 years stretch across my face. "It is startup capital. Put your safety vest in the trash, Lucas. You are done moving boxes." We incorporated the next day. We called it E&L Architecture. Ethan and Lucas. It was a partnership in the truest sense. While I handled the design and engineering, Lucas took over operations. It turned out that the same meticulous precision required to weld underwater pipelines made him a brilliant director of operations. I paid for him to take an executive management course, but he barely needed it. He negotiated contracts with the ruthlessness of a man who knew the value of a dollar because he had lost every single one of them to save his brother. Success hit us like a tidal wave. Within 18 months, we were not just solvent, we were wealthy. We moved out of the basement and into a penthouse overlooking the very riverfront I was redesigning. We had a staff of 15 people. We wore tailored suits to board meetings and flew business class to conferences in Tokyo and Berlin. But to the outside world, specifically to our family, we were ghosts. We made a pact of absolute silence. We knew that if Richard and Patricia smelled money, they would come sniffing around with lawsuits or guilt trips, so we engaged in extreme stealth wealth. We kept the lease on the basement apartment as a mailing address. We kept the dented sedan I had bought for $500. On the rare occasions we had to attend a funeral or a distant cousin's wedding, we wore off the rat clothes and looked tired. It was a delicious, silent power. We would stand in the back of the room sipping cheap punch, listening to rumors about how Ethan was a starving artist and Lucas was a broken-down laborer. We let them pity us. We let them whisper. They had no idea that the city skyline rising in the distance was being built by the very sons they had thrown away. While they were drowning in debt to maintain the illusion of wealth, we were quietly building an empire on a foundation of concrete and brotherhood. While Lucas and I were quietly building an empire, the house of cards my parents had constructed was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The economic downturn that hit the country 2 years later was not kind to people who lived on credit and vanity. My father Richard had always fancied himself a wolf of Wall Street, but in reality, he was a gambler who got lucky once and thought it was a strategy. When the tech bubble burst and interest rates hiked, his portfolio did not just dip, it evaporated. I still remember the day the rumors started circulating in our old neighborhood. Richard was seen screaming at his broker on the golf course, a vein bulging in his forehead, before throwing his club into the water hazard. He had leveraged their retirement accounts to cover the margin calls, convinced the market would bounce back. It never did. Suddenly, the lifestyle they had weaponized against us became a noose around their necks. The heaviest weight was the Golden Brittany. The yacht that had been chosen over my leg was now a floating liability. Fuel prices had skyrocketed, making a single weekend trip cost more than a mortgage payment. The marina raised their slip fees to $3,000 a month. The salt air was eating away at the chrome, and the engine needed a $10,000 service that Richard simply could not afford. But his ego was too fragile to sell it. To sell the boat would be to admit defeat, so he let it sit there, accumulating barnacles and debt, a white elephant bleeding them dry, one invoice at a time. As if the financial hemorrhaging was not enough, the family brand took a fatal hit from its star player. Brittany's influencer career, which had been the source of so much arrogance, imploded in spectacular fashion. She had launched a signature skincare line called Glow by Brit, claiming it was made with rare botanical extracts from the Swiss Alps. In reality, internet sleuths discovered she was buying bulk lotion from a discount wholesaler in China and slapping a gold sticker on the bottle. The class action lawsuit was swift. Customers were posting photos of chemical burns and rashes. Her sponsors dropped her overnight. The luxury car lease was repossessed. The penthouse apartment in the city was vacated. Brittany, the golden child who had mocked my poverty, was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom at 28 years old. The atmosphere in the mansion was toxic. You had 3 adults living beyond their means, watching their bank balances dwindle to zero, yet refusing to cut back on expensive wines or country club dinners. They were eating into the equity of the house just to keep the lights on. They were desperate for a lifeline, any lifeline, to maintain the illusion that they were still the royalty of the Hamptons. They needed a miracle or a victim to exploit. And that was when they remembered the lake house. Desperation has a distinct smell. In the marble halls of my parents' mansion, it smelled like stale scotch and panic. Richard and Patricia were cornered. Their liquid assets were gone, drained by the insatiable appetite of their lifestyle and the legal fees from Brittany's imploding career. They were facing foreclosure, not just on the yacht, but on the estate itself. But my father, ever the opportunist, remembered the one thing he had not yet squandered: Grandma Eleanor's lake house. It was a pristine 20-acre property on the edge of Lake Tahoe, bought decades ago for a song, but now sitting in the middle of the most desirable real estate in the country. A luxury resort conglomerate had been quietly sending offers for years. The latest one was sitting on Richard's desk, $5 million. It was enough to wipe out their debts, refurbish the yacht, and secure their status for another decade. There was just one problem. My grandmother knew exactly who her son was. She had passed away 10 years ago, leaving a will that was ironclad. To prevent Richard from gambling away the family legacy, she had placed the lake house in a generation-skipping trust. The deed could only be transferred or sold with the unanimous written consent of all living direct descendants. That meant Richard needed signatures. Specifically, he needed mine and Lucas's. For a normal father, this would mean a conversation. For Richard, it meant a scheme. He sat in his study with Patricia, poring over the trust documents, convinced that he could outsmart us. In their minds, Lucas was still moving boxes at a warehouse, and I was a starving artist living in a basement. They assumed we were desperate, hungry, and easily manipulated. The plan they hatched was simple and cruel. They would tell us the property was dilapidated, a tax burden that needed to be offloaded immediately. They would claim the sale price was only $200,000, a fraction of its true value. Then they would offer to split the proceeds, giving Lucas and me $10,000 each as a gesture of goodwill. To them, throwing 10 grand at us was like feeding pigeons in the park. They were certain we would scramble for the crumbs, signing away a multi-million-dollar asset for the price of a used Honda. I know this because Dion told me later. He stood in the doorway of the study, listening to them laugh about how easy it would be. Patricia actually said that $10,000 would probably feel like a lottery win to people like us. She practiced her pitch, rehearsing a tone of benevolent pity. They were not just planning to steal our inheritance, they were planning to savor the act of shortchanging us one last time. They had no idea that the sons they were planning to swindle were already reviewing the same $5 million offer sent directly to our penthouse by a real estate agent who knew exactly who the real decision-makers were. They were setting a trap for two wolves they mistook for sheep. The phone vibrated against the polished mahogany of my executive desk, the sound jarring in the quiet hum of our penthouse office. I looked at the screen and felt a cold jolt of recognition. The caller ID read, Mother. It had been exactly 730 days since she had watched security drag me off her property. 2 years of absolute silence. Not a birthday card. Not a Christmas text. Not even a curiosity check to see if I still had 2 legs. I looked across the desk at Lucas. He was reviewing the structural specs for a new 30-story eco-tower we were breaking ground on next month. He saw my expression and froze. I tapped the speakerphone icon and placed the device between us. Hello, Patricia, I said, keeping my voice neutral, stripped of any emotion. Ethan, darling. Her voice trilled through the speaker, dripping with a synthetic sweetness that made my skin crawl. Is that any way to greet your mother? We have been so worried about you. It has been far too long. I watched Lucas's jaw tighten. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. We did not speak. We let her fill the silence with her performance. Your father and I were just sitting here on the yacht sipping our morning coffee, and we realized how terrible it is that we have let silly misunderstandings keep us apart, she continued, the lie sliding off her tongue like oil. We want to fix this, Ethan. We want to be a family again. We are hosting a small, intimate reconciliation dinner this Saturday on the Golden Brittany. Just family. We want you and Lucas to come home. I muted the microphone for a second. Lucas looked at me and smirked a dark, knowing expression. They are desperate, he whispered. They must have the paperwork for the lake house ready. I unmuted the phone. That sounds charming, I said, forcing a tone of hesitant gratitude. I assume Lucas is invited too, even without his truck. Oh, stop it! She laughed, a nervous tinkling sound. That is all in the past. We want to see both of you. We have all grown. We have all changed. Please say you will come. It would mean the world to your father. I looked around our office, the awards on the shelf, the view of the city we were literally reshaping, the security of knowing we had millions in the bank while they were drowning in debt. I knew exactly what this dinner was. It was an ambush. They thought they were inviting 2 starving dogs to toss them a bone in exchange for a signature. They had no idea they were inviting the wolves inside the gate. We will be there, Patricia, I said. We wouldn't miss it for the world. Wonderful. She exhaled, clearly relieved that her charm offensive had worked. 7 o'clock. Dress nicely, darling. We want everything to be perfect. She hung up. The line went dead. Lucas picked up his pen and spun it between his fingers. Dress nicely, he repeated, shaking his head. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city below. They want us to play the part of the poor, grateful children, I said. So let's play along. But when we get on that boat, we are not just guests. We are the owners. Lucas grinned, and for the first time in years, it wasn't a smile of survival. It was a smile of anticipation. Let's go buy some cheap suits, he said. If they want a show, let's give them a performance they will never forget. Before we set foot on that gangplank, I needed to know exactly what we were walking into. I hired a forensic accountant and a private investigator the moment I hung up the phone with my mother. I was not going to let them ambush us with a sob story without verifying the facts. 2 days before the dinner, a courier dropped a thick manila folder on my desk. Lucas and I opened it together, and what we found inside was not just financial trouble. It was a complete and total catastrophe. The report was a sea of red ink. My parents were not just broke, they were destitute. They had taken out 3 mortgages on the estate to fund their country club lifestyle. They had maxed out 11 credit cards. But the most satisfying detail was the status of the Golden Brittany. The yacht that had cost me my leg, the vessel my father had chosen over his own son, was 90 days past due on payments. The bank had already issued a notice of default. They were days away from repossession. I looked at the paperwork, and a cold strategic calm washed over me. My father thought he was the master of the universe, but in reality, he was a squatter on a boat he no longer owned. I picked up the internal line and called my chief financial officer. "Get me the vice president of commercial lending at First National," I ordered. The one holding the note on Richard's maritime assets. 10 minutes later, I was on a secure line with the bank. They were hesitant at first, citing privacy laws, until I explained that my firm E&L Architecture was interested in acquiring a distressed asset portfolio to expand our corporate holdings. Money talks, and when you have millions in liquidity banks, listen. "I do not want to pay off the loan," I clarified, leaning back in my chair. "I want to purchase the debt. I want to buy the note on the Sea Ray 500 registered to Richard. I will pay the full principal and interest in cash today." There was a stunned silence on the other end. Buying bad debt is a common practice for collection agencies, but for a private individual to buy a specific mortgage was rare. However, the bank was desperate to get the toxic asset off their books. They agreed. By 5 o'clock that evening, the wire transfer was complete. My printer hummed, spitting out the transfer of lien document. I picked up the warm paper and stared at it. It was official. Richard was no longer indebted to the bank. He was indebted to me. Technically, I could seize the boat right now, but that would be too easy. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized that the captain of his ship was the son he had thrown overboard. I placed the document in a thin leather portfolio and slid it across the desk to Lucas. "Keep this safe," I said. "We are going to need it for dessert." Lucas looked at the document, his eyes widening as he realized what I had done. "You bought the boat," he whispered. "No," I corrected him. "I bought the leverage. Now let's go see what they want to trade for a few more days of dignity." The hallway outside Richard's study was lined with portraits of ancestors who would have likely rolled in their graves if they knew what was happening inside. Dion stood in the shadow of a marble bust, his hand hovering over the brass door handle. He had intended to ask his father-in-law about the catering logistics for the upcoming party, but the sound of raucous laughter stopped him cold. It was the sound of hunters dividing a kill. He leaned in closer, the heavy oak door doing little to muffle Richard's booming voice. "The plan is foolproof," Richard declared, the clink of crystal indicating he was pouring another drink. "I spoke to the developer this morning. The offer stands at $5 million cash for the land. But obviously we are not telling the boys that." Dion felt a chill run down his spine. He pressed his ear against the wood. Brittany giggled, a sound that used to charm him, but now grated on his nerves like sandpaper. "So what is the number on the paper we give them?" she asked. 200,000. Richard replied, his tone dripping with arrogance. "We tell them the market has bottomed out, the property is full of dry rot, and it is a liability. We offer them 10,000 each as a pity payout to sign away their rights." 10,000, Brittany laughed harder. "Dad, that is insulting. I spent more than that on my handbag." Richard joined in the laughter. "That is exactly the point, Princess. You have to remember who we are dealing with. Ethan is a cripple living in a basement, and Lucas is a manual laborer. To people like them, $10,000 is a fortune. They are hungry. They are desperate. They will see that check and sign before the ink is dry. They will probably thank us for it." Dayon stepped back from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt physically ill. He looked down at his own hands, dark skin against the white cuff of his dress shirt. He remembered what hunger felt like. He remembered growing up in a housing project in Detroit, watching his single mother work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. He had fought for every inch of ground he gained in the corporate world. He had faced prejudice, skepticism, and closed doors, but he had never compromised his integrity. What Richard and Brittany were planning was not business. It was not strategy. It was a hate crime against their own blood. They were relying on the assumption that Ethan and Lucas were too poor and too stupid to know the value of what they owned. It was the worst kind of elitist predation, and Dion was married to it. He looked at the wedding ring on his finger. For years, he had made excuses for Brittany's behavior, blaming it on her upbringing or her insecurity. But this was indefensible. She was not just a spoiled brat, she was an accomplice to fraud. Dean turned away from the door, leaving the conversation undisturbed. He did not burst in. He did not make a scene. That would only tip them off. Instead, he walked silently down the long, opulent hallway, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Ethan's contact info. He did not call. Not yet. He needed to play his part. He would let Richard and Brittany think they had won. He would let them set the table for their victory feast. And then he would personally hand Ethan the knife to cut the table legs off. Dion pocketed his phone, his face setting into a hard, grim line. The lawyer in him had just taken the case, and he had never lost when the evidence was this damning. We pulled into the marina parking lot in a rented gray sedan that smelled faintly of stale pine air freshener and cigarette smoke. It was a calculated choice, a prop in the theater of poverty we were about to perform. Lucas killed the engine, the car sputtering slightly before falling silent. Through the windshield, we could see the golden Brittany bobbing in its slip. From a distance, the vessel still held an air of majesty glowing under the dock lights. But as an architect, I was trained to see the details others missed. I saw the streaks of rust running down the anchor chain. I saw the dull haze on the unpolished chrome railings. It was a floating metaphor for my parents' life, impressive from afar, but rotting at the seams. We stepped out of the car. I adjusted the collar of the polyester suit I had bought at a discount outlet yesterday. It was ill-fitting and scratchy, perfect for the role of a struggling son looking for a handout. Lucas looked uncomfortable in his tie, shifting his weight, his eyes scanning the dock with the wariness of a man entering a cage match. "Relax," I murmured, closing the car door with a hollow thud. "We are not here to fight. We are here to foreclose." We began the long walk down the pier. The last time I had been here, I was dragged across this asphalt by security guards, my legs screaming in agony. Tonight, the wood of the dock felt solid beneath my dress shoes. I focused on the rhythm of my steps. Heel 2, heel 2. The titanium rod in my tibia took my weight without a whisper of complaint. I was not limping, I was marching. Brittany was waiting for us on the aft deck. She was leaning against the railing, a glass of white wine in her hand, wearing a dress that was likely from a previous season. She looked thinner. Her face contoured heavily to hide the stress of her public cancellation, but her sneer was as sharp as ever. She watched our approach with the amusement of a queen looking down at peasants. "Well, look who finally decided to show up." She called out, her voice shrill enough to turn heads on the neighboring boats. "The charity case and the laborer." She took a sip of her wine, her eyes raking over our cheap suits with obvious disdain. "Just a heads up, boys. We just had the teak scrubbed. Try not to track any mud on board. I know you are used to dirt floors, but we have standards here. Wipe your shoes before you step on the gangplank. Seriously, scrub them." Lucas's jaw clenched so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. He took a step forward, his fists balling up at his sides, ready to shout back. I stopped him with a single firm hand on his shoulder. I looked up at my sister. She was expecting the broken, desperate man she had filmed 2 years ago. She was expecting a limp. She was expecting shame. Instead, I locked eyes with her and smiled. It was a cold, flat smile that didn't reach my eyes. I walked up the ramp with a smooth, powerful stride, the metal echoing under my feet. I stopped inches from her, towering over her, in a way I never had before. We wiped our feet. "Brittany?" I said, my voice calm and low, carrying the weight of the secret I held in my jacket pocket. "You should worry less about the floor and more about the foundation. Nice boat. Enjoy it while the ice lasts." The party was a masterclass in deception. Richard had invited the creme de la creme of his social circle, or at least the ones who still believed he was solvent. Men in bespoke tuxedos smoked cigars near the helm, while women dripping in diamonds discussed their summer homes in the French Riviera. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the salty decay of the harbor, a fitting combination for the evening. Lucas and I stood by the bar holding glasses of sparkling water because neither of us trusted ourselves with alcohol. We were the anomalies in the room, the glitch in the matrix of wealth. Our off-the-rack suits stood out against the sea of silk and velvet, drawing side eyes and whispered comments. But Patricia did not hide us. Instead, she paraded us around like rescue dogs she had graciously decided not to euthanize. She glided through the crowd, hooking her arm through mine with a grip that felt like a shackle. "Everyone, I want you to meet my sons," she announced, her voice trembling with performative emotion. "This is Ethan and Lucas. They have had such a difficult journey. Life has not been kind to them, and they have made some unfortunate career choices, but they are still family." A woman with a pearl necklace clucked her tongue sympathetically. "It is so noble of you to support them, Patricia. Most parents would have cut ties after so many failures." Patricia sighed, looking at us with sad, doe-like eyes. A mother's love is unconditional even when her children are struggling to find their way in the world. We just want to give them a taste of the good life tonight. She led us toward the buffet, which was laden with lobster tails, prime rib, and tins of caviar. Lucas, who had skipped lunch to prepare for this, reached for a porcelain plate. He moved toward the seafood tower, his eyes on a fresh prawn. Patricia's hand shot out, intercepting him. She grabbed the tongs from his hand with a sharp metallic clatter. "Oh, Lucas, honey, no!" she scolded loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Leave the lobster for the investors. You know your stomach cannot handle rich food. You are used to simpler fare." She moved the tongs away from the prime cuts and picked up a few dry end pieces of the roast beef and a slightly burnt dinner roll. She dropped them onto his plate with a wet thud. "There. That is plenty for you. We do not want to be greedy, do we?" She looked at him with a smile that was pure venom, daring him to react, daring him to cause a scene so she could play the victim again. Lucas looked down at the scraps on his plate, then at the lavish spread denied to him. His face remained impassive, but I saw the muscles in his neck corded with tension. He was being treated like a stray animal at a banquet he legally co-owned. I stepped in close to him, my shoulder brushing his. "Eat it," I whispered, barely moving my lips. "Let her feed you scraps. It will be the last meal she ever serves in this house." Lucas looked at me, took a bite of the dry bread, and chewed slowly, staring directly at our father across the room. The food might have been garbage, but the taste of impending victory was sweeter than any lobster on that table. The noise of the party faded instantly as Richard closed the heavy soundproof door of the VIP stateroom. The air inside was thick, smelling of conditioned leather and the expensive cigars my father smoked to look the part of a tycoon. He did not offer us a seat. Instead, he walked behind the large mahogany desk that dominated the room, establishing his position of power. Patricia stood by the wet bar, crossing her arms and watching us with a look that was half pity, half impatience. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a blue folder. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it across the desk with a flick of his wrist. The paper slid across the polished wood and stopped inches from my hand. It was a gesture of supreme disrespect, the way one might toss a newspaper to a dog. "Let us cut to the chase, boys," Richard said, leaning back in the captain's chair. "Your mother and I have been doing some estate planning. We are liquidating some of the dead weight in the portfolio. Grandma Eleanor's lake house has become a burden. It is falling apart. The foundation is cracked, the roof is gone, and the property taxes are bleeding us dry." He paused, waiting for us to react to his lie. When we stayed silent, he continued. "We found a developer willing to take the scrap off our hands. The market is terrible right now, so the price is low. 200,000 for the whole lot. But since the deed requires family consensus, we need your signatures to close the deal." Patricia chimed in, her voice dripping with fake benevolence. "We know how hard things have been for you two, so we decided to be generous. We are going to give you each $10,000 from the sale. That is a lot of money. It is a chance for you to pay off your debts, maybe buy some decent clothes and start over. It is a life-changing opportunity for people in your position." $10,000. Lucas repeated, his voice low and vibrating with rage. Richard smirked. "Do not look a gift horse in the mouth, son. Just sign the papers. Consider it a stimulus package for the less fortunate." I saw Lucas snap. His shoulders squared and his right hand balled into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white. He took a step toward the desk, his eyes locked on Richard's smug face. He was going to hit him. He was going to shatter our father's jaw right there in the VIP room. I reached out instantly, grabbing Lucas's forearm with a grip of steel. My fingers dug into his muscle, anchoring him in place. I looked at him, shaking my head slightly. Not like this. Physical violence would only get us arrested and give them the moral high ground. We needed to destroy them, not hurt them. Lucas looked at me, his chest heaving, the fury radiating off him in waves. He saw the cold calculation in my eyes and slowly, painfully unclenched his fist. I picked up the pen from the desk. I did not look at the contract. I looked at Richard. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice smooth. $10,000 is a significant amount of money. But before we sign, there is just one small detail we need to clarify. I twirled the cheap ballpoint pen between my fingers, staring at the contract that would legally rob us of millions. To my father, my hesitation was just stupidity. He tapped his manicured finger aggressively on the signature line, the sound echoing like a ticking clock in the tense room. "Sign it, Ethan." Richard snapped, his patience evaporating. "Stop stalling. We have guests waiting outside, and I do not have all night to watch you read words you probably do not understand. Just put your name on the line." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and condescension. "Look, I am doing you a favor here. Do not be an idiot. $10,000 is a lot of money for people in your bracket. That is probably a whole year's salary for Lucas, considering he has no tools and no truck." Lucas made a low, guttural sound in his throat, a growl of pure animalistic rage. He shifted his weight, ready to lunge, but I pressed my knee against his leg under the desk, a silent command to hold the line. Richard did not even notice. He was too busy gloating, too busy enjoying the feeling of being the benevolent patriarch throwing crumbs to the peasants. Brittany stepped away from the door, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at us with a mixture of boredom and menace. "You heard, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "Just sign the papers so we can go back to the party. And do not think you can just walk out of here without doing it." She gestured vaguely toward the heavy steel door. "We are in the middle of the harbor. You do not get off this boat until you sign. This is Mom and Dad's property. The land is theirs. The money is theirs. Whatever they decide to give you is a gift, not a right. So stop acting like you have a choice." I looked up at my sister. She was threatening to hold us hostage on a vessel she did not know I owned, to force us to sell land she did not know I had already appraised. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. They were trying to bully us with power they no longer possessed. Patricia sighed from the corner, checking her watch. "Boys, please, do not ruin the evening. We are trying to help you get back on your feet. Do not make us treat you like children." I looked down at the paper again. The terms were clear. They were selling the family legacy for pennies to a shell company likely to flip it later for the full $5 million. It was fraud. It was theft. And it was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I stopped twirling the pen. I set it down on the desk with a deliberate click. I looked at Richard, then at Brittany, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. They thought I was breaking. They thought I was submitting. They had no idea that I was just waiting for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine. "You are right, Richard," I said softly. "We should not keep the guests waiting. But there is a problem with your math. And there is a massive problem with your ownership." The silence in the room was shattered not by a shout, but by a quiet, deliberate movement. Before Richard could unleash his temper at my refusal to sign, a hand reached across the mahogany desk. It was steady, dark, and precise. Dion picked up the blue folder that Richard had thrown at us like garbage. He did not look at his wife, who was glaring at him with confusion, nor did he look at Richard. He opened the folder, scanned the legal jargon he likely already knew by heart, and closed it with a soft, final thud. "Richard Brittany Dion," said, his voice calm, but possessing a density that sucked the air out of the room. "I cannot in good conscience allow this transaction to proceed." Richard looked at him as if his own shadow had just started speaking. He blinked rapidly, the scotch in his glass sloshing over the rim. "Excuse me," he sputtered, his face turning a shade of dangerous crimson. Dion put the papers back. "This is a family matter. What are you doing? Whose side are you on?" Dion adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, a gesture I had seen him do 1,000 times in court, usually right before he destroyed a witness. He turned to face his father-in-law, his posture rigid. "I am on the side of the law," Richard Dion replied, his tone icy. And I am on the side of basic human decency. Brittany stepped forward, her hands shaking. Dion, stop it, she hissed. You are embarrassing me. Give them the pen. Dion ignored her. He held up the contract, waving it slightly. I read this draft, Richard. It states that the sale price of the Lake Tahoe property is $200,000 due to market depreciation. It claims the property is a liability. He paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air before dropping the hammer. But we all know that is a lie. I saw the appraisal on your desk this morning. I saw the offer letter from the resort conglomerate. The real value of that land is $5 million. Not 200,000. $5 million. A gasp escaped Patricia's lips. She pressed a hand to her chest, looking between the men with wide, terrified eyes. The secret was out. The deception was laid bare on the table, ugly and undeniable. Dion took a step closer to the desk, his voice hardening into the steel of a prosecutor. You are attempting to coerce two people you believe to be financially vulnerable into signing away a multi-million-dollar asset for pennies. In the legal world, Richard, we do not call this estate planning. We call it fraud, specifically theft by deception. And since you sent this contract across state lines via courier to their address before tonight, you are also looking at federal mail fraud. He threw the folder back onto the desk. It landed next to Richard's untouched scotch. I worked my way up from the bottom, Richard. I know what it is like to be hungry, and I will not stand here and watch you cannibalize your own sons just to keep your country club membership. I am a lawyer, not an accomplice. Richard sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The power dynamic in the room had shifted violently. He looked at Dion, then at the contract, and finally at me. He realized too late that the walls were closing in and the first brick had been thrown by his own son-in-law. I stood up slowly, the movement smooth and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting in my father's eyes. The room felt suddenly small, the air sucked dry by the revelation of their greed. I picked up the contract, the document that was supposed to swindle Lucas and me out of our birthright, and walked toward the electric fireplace built into the starboard wall. It was a tacky faux log display that flickered with orange LED light, a perfect symbol for my parents' artificial warmth with zero substance. I crumbled the blue folder in my fist, the crisp paper buckling under the pressure of my grip, and tossed it into the fake flames. It bounced off the plastic logs and landed on the floor, trash where it belonged. You think I need your $10,000? I asked, my voice dropping to a register that was barely a whisper yet echoed off the mahogany walls. You think I came here because I am hungry? Richard opened his mouth to speak, to bluster, to command, but I cut him off with a look so cold it could have frozen the champagne in his glass. 2 years ago I called you from an emergency room. I continued, stepping closer to the desk until I was looming over him. I was 29 years old. I was terrified. I was looking at my own bone protruding through my skin. I asked you for $20,000, not for a car, not for a vacation, for a surgery to save my leg. I pointed a shaking finger at the floor, at the very deck we were standing on. And you told me you were illiquid. You told me priorities were priorities. You bought this boat. You bought this floating heap of fiberglass and vanity on the exact same afternoon you decided your son was not worth the cost of a used sedan. Richard looked away, unable to meet my gaze, his face a mask of flushed embarrassment and stubborn pride. But Patricia, ever the victim, could not let the moment pass without rewriting the narrative. Oh, for heaven's sake, Ethan, she snapped, throwing her hands up in the air. Why do you always have to bring up ancient history? It was a chaotic time. We made a financial decision based on the information we had. She took a sip of her drink, her eyes narrowing with disdain. You are so incredibly vindictive. It is ugly, really. We invite you here to make peace, to give you money, and you throw a tantrum about something that happened years ago. You hold a grudge like a child. Move on. A grudge. I repeated, feeling a dark, humorless laugh bubble up in my chest. You think this is a grudge? No, Mother. A grudge is when you are angry about a missed birthday. This is a reckoning. You let me bleed in a hallway. You let Lucas sell his livelihood to fix your mistake, and now you want to steal from us again to pay for the very boat you chose over my life. I leaned down, placing my hands flat on the desk, bringing my face inches from Richard's sweating forehead. I am not here for your money, Dad. I do not want your 10,000. I do not want your charity. I am here to return the favor. You taught me that business comes before family. You taught me that assets are more important than blood. So I took your lesson to heart. And I learned it better than you ever did. The sound that broke the tension wasn't a scream or a sob, it was laughter. Lucas threw his head back and laughed, a deep, resonant sound that bounced off the wood paneling. It was the laugh of a man who had been holding a winning lottery ticket while watching someone try to cheat him out of $1. He reached into the pocket of his ill-fitting polyester trousers and pulled out his phone. It was a newer model now, not the cracked screen he had 2 years ago, but he kept it in a battered case to maintain the ruse. He unlocked the screen and opened his banking app. He walked over to Brittany, who was still standing with her arms crossed, looking at us like we were insects. You were so worried about my financial literacy, Brittany, Lucas said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. You told the whole family I was a financial risk. You told them to never lend me money. He shoved the phone inches from her face. So I just wanted to make sure I am doing okay. Can you check the math for me? Is that enough zeros? Brittany recoiled slightly, then her eyes darted to the screen. She froze. Her mouth fell open and the color drained from her cheeks, as if someone had pulled a plug. She wasn't looking at a few $1,000s. She was looking at a liquid cash balance that started with a digit and was followed by a comical number of commas. That is impossible, she whispered, her voice trembling. It is a glitch. It has to be a fake app. It is not a glitch, I said, stepping forward to stand beside my brother. And it is not fake. It is dividends. I turned to Richard, who was staring at Brittany's horrified expression with growing unease. The arrogance was starting to crack, replaced by a dawning, terrifying realization. You really haven't been paying attention to the industry, have you, Dad? I asked, smoothing out the lapel of my cheap jacket. You were so busy drowning in your own debt that you didn't notice who was building the skyline right outside your window. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. Allow me to reintroduce us properly. I am the CEO and lead architect of E&L Architecture. And Lucas, the man you tried to feed scraps to, is my chief operating officer. Richard's eyes went wide. The glass of scotch slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, splashing amber liquid over his expensive Italian shoes. He didn't even flinch. E&L, he stammered, his voice barely audible. The firm that won the Resilience Project, the firm that just signed the Skyrise contract. E for Ethan, L for Lucas. I confirmed, cold and sharp. We didn't just survive, Richard. We thrived. Last year alone, our net revenue was 10 times the value of your entire estate, including this sinking boat and the house you are about to lose to the bank. I walked over to the desk and picked up the pen I had refused to use earlier. I snapped it in half and dropped the pieces onto the blotting pad. So you can keep your $10,000. We don't need your charity. In fact, looking at your financials, it seems you are the ones who need a handout. We could buy this entire marina with this quarter's bonus check and still have enough left over to buy Brittany a real business. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the airlock. Patricia slumped against the wet bar, clutching her pearls, looking at us as if we were strangers who had just beamed down from another planet. Richard's face was a mask of gray ash. He looked from me to Lucas, seeing not the broken sons he had discarded, but the titans he had created through his own cruelty. He realized in that suffocating silence that he was no longer the king of his castle. He was a pauper standing in the court of the emperors he had tried to kill. Richard stared at the shattered glass on the floor, his mind unable to process the paradigm shift. He was still reeling from the revelation of our wealth, but Dion was not done dismantling him. My brother-in-law reached into his slim leather briefcase. He didn't pull out a lawsuit or a threat. He pulled out a yellowed photocopy of the original trust deed from Grandma Eleanor. Richard, you really should have read the fine print before you tried to hustle your own children, Dion said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a scalpel. He placed the document on the wet desk, careful to avoid the puddle of spilled scotch. Grandma Eleanor was a sharp woman. Dion continued, his finger tracing a paragraph on the last page. She loved you, but she knew you were a gambler. She didn't trust you with the family legacy. That is why she included Article 7, Section C, the fiduciary breach clause. Richard looked up, his eyes unfocused. "What are you talking about?" he croaked. Dion adjusted his glasses, reading the text aloud with the cadence of a judge passing sentence. In the event that the custodian attempts to mislead, defraud, or misrepresent the value of the estate assets to the beneficiaries for personal gain, the custodian's executive rights are immediately terminated. Full legal title shall transfer automatically and irrevocably to the surviving grandchildren. The color drained from Patricia's face. She grabbed Richard's arm, her fingernails digging into his suit jacket. "Richard, what does that mean?" she whispered, panic rising in her voice. "It means," Dion said, closing the folder with a sharp snap, "that by presenting this fraudulent contract for $200,000 when you possessed an appraisal for $5 million, you triggered the penalty. You committed documented fraud. You do not own the land anymore, Richard. You do not even have a voting share in it. As of the moment you handed Ethan that pen and lied about the value, the property belongs 100% to Ethan and Lucas." I looked at Dion, a genuine appreciation swelling in my chest. He had risked his marriage and his social standing to hand us the smoking gun. "Thank you, Dion," I said, nodding respectfully. I turned back to my father, who looked as if he were having a cardiac event. He was clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Did you hear that, Dad?" I asked, leaning casually against the desk that was no longer a symbol of his power, but a monument to his failure. "You got greedy. If you had just played it straight, if you had treated us like partners instead of prey, you might have walked away with a management fee. You might have saved your retirement. But because you tried to steal the crumbs, you lost the whole loaf. So that $5 million payout from the resort developer," I continued, my voice calm and deadly. "It is all ours now. Every single cent. You just handed us the only liquid asset you had left to save yourselves." Patricia let out a strangled sob. "But we have bills. We have the mortgage on the house, the yacht fees. You cannot just take it all. We will be destitute." "We didn't take anything," Mother Lucas said, stepping in, his voice hard. "Grandma took it from you. She knew exactly what kind of man Richard was. It just took you 10 years to prove her right. And frankly, $5 million is a nice bonus for E&L Architecture. We might use it to build a community center. Or maybe a shelter for people whose families abandoned them." Richard looked like a cornered animal. His face was a map of broken veins and sheer panic. He gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white, trying to steady a world that was rapidly spinning out of orbit. The loss of the land was a sledgehammer blow, but his ego refused to die. He looked around the stateroom, his eyes landing on the expensive teak paneling, desperate to find one thing he still controlled. "Get out!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking. "This is still my property. I don't care what the will says about the land. This is my yacht. I paid the down payment. I am the captain here. Get off my ship before I have you arrested for trespassing." He lunged toward the intercom to call security, but I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my cheap suit jacket and pulled out the thin leather portfolio I had prepared earlier that day. "Actually, Richard, that is not entirely accurate," I said, my voice calm, slicing through his hysteria like a razor. I placed the single sheet of heavy watermarked paper on the desk, right on top of the spilled scotch. "You see, I knew you were desperate. I knew you were cash poor. So I had my forensic accountants run a little check on your liabilities. It turns out the Golden Brittany isn't really yours. It belongs to First National Bank, or rather it did until 9 o'clock this morning." Richard froze, his hand hovering over the intercom button. He looked at the paper, his eyes widening, as he recognized the bank's logo and the bold legal header, "Assignment of Debt and Transfer of Lien." "You missed your last 3 payments, Dad," I explained, stepping closer. "You are 90 days in default. The bank was preparing to repossess the vessel next week. They were quite relieved when E&L Architecture offered to purchase the entire note for cash. They sold us your bad debt at a discount." I tapped the paper with my index finger. "Legally, I am the lien holder. I own the mortgage on this boat, and since the contract states that the note holder has the right to immediate possession upon default, I paused, looking him dead in the eye, savoring the moment. I am not trespassing, Richard. I am the owner. This is my boat. You are the one who is trespassing on company property. Patricia let out a high-pitched wail, clutching Brittany's arm. No, you cannot do this. This is our home. We have nowhere else to go. That sounds like a personal problem, Lucas said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. He walked over to the mini fridge, took out a bottle of premium water, cracked it open, and took a long sip. Maybe you should have prioritized your payments, instead of throwing parties you couldn't afford. Isn't that what you always told us? Fiscal responsibility? Richard slumped into his chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked small. The titan of industry, the man who had mocked my injury and Lucas's poverty, was now sitting in a chair he didn't own on a boat he didn't pay for, staring at the sons he had betrayed. So here is how this is going to work, I said, checking my watch. I am seizing this asset effective immediately. I will give you 10 minutes to pack your personal effects. Clothes and toiletries only. Everything else, the furniture, the art, the electronics, stays. It is collateral against the interest you owe me. I turned to the door and opened it, gesturing to the hallway. After that, you will walk down that gangplank. And if you refuse, I won't call the police. I will call the Coast Guard, and I will have you removed for squatting on a commercial vessel. The choice is yours. Tick-tock, Dad. I did not wait for my father to beg. I did not give him the satisfaction of negotiating. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked the screen, and typed a single word into the message thread I had opened with the harbor master and the private security firm I had retained. Execute. 2 seconds later, the gentle lapping of the water against the hull was drowned out by the ear-splitting wail of a siren. It did not come from the street. It came from the water. Blue and red strobe lights exploded against the portholes of the VIP stateroom, washing the panicked faces of my family in a harsh, rotating glare. "What is that?" Patricia shrieked, covering her ears. "What have you done?" I turned and walked out of the stateroom, Lucas right behind me. We stepped onto the main deck where the party had ground to a confused halt. The jazz band had stopped playing. The guests were crowding the railings, champagne flutes forgotten in their hands. Alongside the Golden Brittany, a sleek police interceptor and a heavy-duty commercial tugboat had pulled up. Men in tactical windbreakers, emblazoned with maritime asset recovery, were already throwing lines over the cleats and boarding the vessel with professional efficiency. Richard stumbled out behind us, his face purple with rage. "Who are you people?" he screamed at a large man in a ball cap who was securing the gangway. "Get off my boat. I will sue the department. I will have your badges." The man ignored him and walked straight to me. He held a clipboard. "Mr. Ethan, we have secured the perimeter. The tug is ready to tow on your command. Do you want the occupants removed now?" "Yes," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the silent deck. I turned to face the crowd of socialites, investors, and fair-weather friends who had spent the last hour eating my parents' food and judging my cheap suit. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?" I announced. "My name is Ethan. I am the CEO of E&L Architecture, and as of this morning, I am the legal owner of this vessel." A gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw whispers exchanging like wildfire. "Due to non-payment and default by the previous owner, Richard Ferd, am declaring a maritime repossession of this asset immediately." I continued, my tone flat and bureaucratic. "This party is over. You are all trespassing on a seized commercial vessel. You have 5 minutes to disembark via the main ramp before the authorities begin processing you for obstruction." The reaction was instantaneous. The veneer of high society crumbled. There was no loyalty to Richard. There was no solidarity. There was only a stampede. Women grabbed their clutches, men downed the last of their drinks, and they surged toward the exit. They looked at Richard not with sympathy, but with the embarrassment of people realizing they had associated with a fraud. Richard stood alone in the center of the deck, watching his social standing evaporate in real time. He reached out to a man he played golf with every Sunday. "Bob, wait, it is a misunderstanding." Bob didn't even make eye contact. He hurried past, muttering about a schedule conflict. Within minutes, the deck was empty save for the recovery team, the police officers, and the 4 members of my family. The silence that followed was heavy and final. The only sound was the idling diesel engine of the tugboat waiting to drag their last symbol of status away to an impound yard. I turned to the lead officer. "Clear the rest of them," I ordered, gesturing to my parents and sister. "If they resist, use handcuffs. I want this deck scrubbed clean." The exodus was undignified. The same people who had been toasting to Richard's health 5 minutes ago were now scrambling over the gangway like rats, fleeing a sinking ship. The clatter of expensive heels on the aluminum ramp sounded like a chaotic drumbeat of abandonment. Richard stood frozen near the buffet table, his hand outstretched toward a business partner who didn't even slow down. "Call me Jim," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can sort this out. It is just a clerical error." Jim didn't look back. He kept his eyes fixed on his Tesla in the parking lot, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear. "Clerical error. They are repossessing the furniture, Richard. It is disgusting. I need to call my broker and dump your stock before the market opens." Patricia fared no better. She tried to grab the arm of a socialite she had known for 20 years. The woman shook her off with a look of pure revulsion, smoothing her silk dress as if Patricia's touch had soiled the fabric. Bankrupt someone whispered the word, hissing through the night air like steam. Frauds. The whispers swirled around my parents, trapping them in a vortex of shame. They were being stripped of their social armor in real time. But it was Brittany who broke the sound barrier. She wasn't fleeing, she was vibrating with the sheer force of her denial. She stomped her foot on the teak deck, a petulant child in a grown woman's body, refusing to accept that playtime was over. "Stop it," she shrieked, lunging at a repo agent who was casually tagging a sculpture with a yellow seizure sticker. "You cannot do this. This is my party. I have influencers coming. I have a live stream scheduled in 10 minutes. You are ruining my brand." She turned to me, her mascara beginning to run in dark streaks down her face, transforming her into a tragic clown. "Ethan, tell them to stop. You are humiliating me. Do you know how many followers I will lose if this gets out? You are destroying my aesthetic." Lucas stepped into her path, blocking her view of me. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked almost bored, the way a teacher looks at a student who refuses to learn a simple lesson. He reached out and plucked the half-empty wine glass from her hand, setting it on a passing waiter's tray. "Your brand," Lucas asked, his voice cutting through her hysterics. "Brittany, you do not have a brand. You have a trust fund. And as of about 20 minutes ago, that fund is empty." She stared at him, her chest heaving, her hands curling into claws. "What are you talking about? Daddy pays for everything. He will fix this." Lucas pulled out his phone again, scrolling through the asset seizure list with a detached professionalism. "Exactly. And since Daddy's assets are currently frozen pending the audit of his bankruptcy and the fraud investigation regarding the land deal that includes all liabilities attached to his primary accounts." He looked up at her, his eyes hard and unyielding. "Your black card declined. The gas card canceled. Even that lease on your convertible is tied to his credit score, which just dropped into the triple digits. You are driving a car you cannot fuel, living in a house you cannot heat, wearing clothes you cannot afford to dry clean." Brittany looked down at her phone, frantically tapping the screen, likely trying to refresh her banking app. When the red error message flashed across her face, she let out a whimper of pure terror. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. I cannot be poor. I do not know how to be poor." Lucas leaned in close, delivering the advice with the weight of someone who had learned it the hard way in a freezing warehouse. "I hear the distribution center is hiring for the night shift," he said, pointing toward the industrial district across the water. "They pay $15 an hour. It is hard work, and your feet will bleed, but hey, at least you can pay for your own data plan. Welcome to the real world, sis. Better start walking before they tow the boat with you on it." The cold wind coming off the harbor whipped across the dock, stinging faces that were already raw from shock. The last of the guests had vanished into the night, their taillights fading like dying embers, leaving only the stark industrial reality of the repossession team securing the yacht. My parents stood huddled together near a pylon, looking like refugees in tuxedos, but Brittany was not done fighting. She turned to the one person she believed was legally bound to save her. Dion, do something, she screamed, grabbing the lapels of her husband's coat and shaking him. You are a lawyer. Sue them. Get an injunction. Ethan is stealing my inheritance. You cannot just stand there and watch him ruin us. Fix this, Dion. Fix it now. Dion did not move. He stood like a statue amidst the wreckage of her life, his face unreadable in the harsh glare of the marina floodlights. Slowly, methodically, he reached up and removed her hands from his coat, peeling her fingers away as if they were sticky with something foul. He stepped back, creating a physical chasm between them that felt wider than the ocean. I cannot fix this, Brittany Dion, said, his voice quiet, but carrying the heavy resonance of a gavel striking wood. Because for the first time in years, justice is actually being served. He reached into his leather briefcase one last time. Brittany's eyes lit up with a flicker of pathetic hope. She thought he was pulling out a writ of subpoena, a loophole that would reverse time and put her back on the yacht with a glass of champagne. Instead, Dion produced a thick cream-colored envelope. It was not sealed. He held it out to her. She stared at it, confusion clouding her tear-streaked face. What is this? Is it money? Did you freeze their accounts? It is a petition for the dissolution of marriage. Dion stated the legal terminology, slicing through the air. I filed it this morning right before I drove here. Brittany recoiled as if the paper were radioactive. She did not take it, so Dion simply let it drop. It landed on the wet, dirty wood of the dock, settling between her expensive heels. Divorce. She gasped the word, struggling to leave her throat. But why? Because we are broke. You are leaving me because of money. Dion laughed, a short, bitter sound. God, you really do not get it. It has nothing to do with the money. I married you because I thought your superficiality was a phase. I thought that underneath the makeup and the filters there was a human being. But tonight I watched you try to defraud your own brothers. I watched you laugh about giving them pennies while you sat on millions. He adjusted his glasses, looking at her with a profound disappointment that hurt worse than anger. I grew up in a neighborhood where family was the only currency we had. We starved together so we could survive together. But you would cannibalize your own blood for a handbag. I cannot share a bed with that kind of spiritual rot. I cannot raise children with a woman who measures love in followers and credit limits. Brittany fell to her knees, her silk dress soaking up the grime of the pier. She reached for his hand, but he stepped out of reach. I am leaving Brittany, and I am taking my reputation with me. Furthermore, he added, turning to nod at Lucas and me, I have formally agreed to represent Ethan and Lucas as their lead counsel in the civil fraud suit against Richard and the estate. I am doing it pro bono. I am going to make sure they get every single dime Grandma Eleanor intended for them. He turned his back on her, buttoning his coat against the wind. He walked over to where Lucas and I stood, offering a hand to each of us. It was a firm, warm shake, the handshake of an ally. Without looking back at the woman sobbing on the ground or the in-laws staring in horror, Dion walked toward his car, leaving Brittany alone on the dock, bankrupt, single, and drowning in the consequences of her own cruelty. The yellow police tape fluttering in the wind was the only decoration left on the dock. It stretched across the gangway of the Golden Brittany, a garish caution against the life my parents used to lead. Richard and Patricia stood on the asphalt, shivering not just from the biting harbor wind, but from the sudden, violent removal of their shelter. They looked like ghosts, pale and insubstantial under the harsh sodium lights of the marina parking lot. Their tuxedos and gowns, once armor against the world, now looked like costumes from a play that had been canceled mid-performance. Lucas and I walked to our rental car in silence. The heavy thud of the trunk closing as we tossed our jackets inside seemed to wake my parents from their stupor. The reality of the night finally pierced their denial. They had no keys. They had no credit cards. They had nowhere to go. The only liquidity they had left was the tears streaming down Patricia's face. They scrambled toward us, abandoning all dignity. Richard, a man who used to command boardrooms with a raised eyebrow, was now half running, half stumbling in his Italian loafers. Patricia hobbled behind him, clutching her shawl. Ethan Lucas. Wait! Richard shouted, his voice ragged and desperate. You cannot just leave us here. We got into the car. I sat in the passenger seat, Lucas behind the wheel. He started the engine, the headlights sweeping over our parents, blinding them for a second. They threw themselves against the vehicle, Richard's palms slapping against the glass of my window. Open the door, Richard pleaded, his face pressed against the glass, distorting his features into a mask of terror. We are your parents. We made a mistake. Okay? We admit it. But you cannot leave your mother on the street. We are family. Patricia was sobbing loudly now, her makeup ruined. We love you. We have always loved you. Please. Ethan, have mercy. I looked at Lucas. He didn't look at them. He looked at me, waiting for the command. I nodded once. I pressed the button and the electric motor hummed as the window rolled down 3 inches. The sound of their frantic breathing filled the cabin. Richard's fingers curled over the top of the glass, trying to hold on. Ethan, thank God, Richard gasped, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. Look, we can work this out. Just give us a ride to a hotel. Just put a card down for us. We are family. You do not do this to family. I looked at him, studying his face. I looked for a trace of the father who should have protected me. I looked for the man who should have sold a boat to save his son's leg. I found nothing but a stranger who was afraid of the dark. Family, I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. I turned my head slightly to look at Lucas, whose profile was illuminated by the dashboard lights. He was the one who had worked himself to the bone. He was the one who sold his dreams to pay for my surgery. He was the one who starved so I could eat. My family is sitting in the driver's seat, I said, my voice low and absolute. My family is the man who pulled me out of the fire you threw me into. I turned back to Richard and Patricia, locking eyes with them one last time. You two? You are just the people who owe me a leg and a childhood. And I have collected on that debt. The account is closed. I hit the button. The window rolled up, forcing Richard to snatch his fingers back to avoid having them crushed. He shouted something else, but the sound was muffled, reduced to meaningless noise. Drive, I said. Lucas shifted the car into gear. We pulled away slowly, leaving them standing in the center of the empty lot. I watched them in the side mirror, shrinking into the distance, 2 small dark figures swallowed by the vastness of the night they had created for themselves. For the first time in my life, I didn't look back. The road ahead was clear, and the only thing I felt was the weightless, intoxicating sensation of freedom. The radiator in the 4th floor walk-up hissed violently, spitting a stream of rusty water onto the linoleum floor. It was the only source of heat in the cramped studio apartment Richard and Patricia now called home. 6 months had passed since the night on the dock, and the fall from grace had been absolute. The bankruptcy courts had been merciless, stripping them of the mansion, the cars, and the remaining stocks to satisfy the mountain of creditors. All they had left were a few suitcases of clothes and the bitter aftertaste of regret. Richard sat at a wobbly laminate table, staring at a laptop that was 3 generations old. He was not checking stock prices anymore. He was refreshing a listing on an online auction site. On the table sat Patricia's last vintage handbag, a Birkin that had once been the envy of the country club. Now it was their rent money. The highest bid was sitting at $600, a fraction of its value, but Richard was desperate enough to take it. He looked older, his skin gray and sagging, without the expensive treatments and vacations. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of Patricia weeping softly in the bathroom, mourning a life that was dead and buried. Across town, under the harsh hum of industrial fluorescent lights, Brittany was learning the true definition of a hard day's work. The girl who once filmed unboxing videos of $1,000 creams was now standing behind the cosmetics counter of a discount superstore. She wore a blue polyester vest that was 2 sizes too big, with a plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. Her feet, forced into sensible black flats, throbbed in a way that reminded her vividly of Lucas's warning on the dock. "Excuse me, are you deaf?" A sharp voice cut through her exhaustion. Brittany snapped to attention. Standing in front of the counter was a woman with a tightly bobbed haircut, holding a tube of mascara like a weapon. I asked for a refund, the woman snapped, slamming the product onto the glass counter. This is garbage. It clumps. I want my money back, and I want to speak to your manager about your attitude. You rolled your eyes at me. Brittany felt the heat rise in her cheeks. A year ago, she would have had security throw this woman out. She would have made a video mocking her fashion sense. But now she glanced at the security camera overhead, knowing that one more complaint would get her fired. And she needed this job. She needed it to pay for the shared room in the boarding house she was living in. I am so sorry, ma'am, Brittany said, the words tasting like bile. I did not mean to offend you. I can process that return for you right now. The woman sneered, leaning in close. You girls at these counters are all the same. Useless. You should be grateful you even have a job. The irony hit Brittany like a physical blow. It was a perfect echo of the words she had spoken to waiters, valets, and her own brothers for her entire adult life. She was looking into a karmic mirror, and the reflection was ugly. She lowered her head, typing the code into the register with trembling fingers, stripped of her pride, forced to serve the very public she had once despised. She handed the receipt to the customer, whispering a quiet, "Have a nice day," while the ghost of her former ego died a little more under the buzzing lights. The developers called us crazy. They told us we were sitting on a lottery ticket and refusing to cash it. They said the smart money was to sell Grandma Eleanor's land to the conglomerate, take the $5 million and run. But Lucas and I were done running. We were done letting other people define the value of our history. We tore up the sale contract and broke ground on something different. We didn't build a generic hotel. We built the Eleanor Reserve. I designed it to breathe with the landscape using local timber and stone, creating a sanctuary that felt like it had grown out of the earth itself. But a building is just a shell without a soul. That is where Lucas came in. We didn't hire an outside management firm. Lucas took the helm. The man who had been belittled for working with his hands was now the general manager of the most exclusive eco-resort on the West Coast. He commanded the staff not with fear, as Richard had, but with the quiet, earned authority of a man who knew how to sweep a floor just as well as he knew how to balance a ledger. On the morning of his 27th birthday, the resort was fully booked, humming with the quiet energy of success. I told Lucas to take a break. He tried to argue, pointing at a stack of invoices, but I pulled the CEO card and led him out to the main driveway. The gravel crunched under our boots, the air smelling of pine and fresh rain. There was a large object covered by a heavy canvas tarp sitting in the center of the circular drive. Lucas looked at it, confused. "We have company vehicles, Ethan," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We don't need another delivery truck." "It is not for the company," I said, handing him a set of keys. "It is for the brother who walked so I could run." Lucas looked at the keys. He frowned. They were vintage keys, heavy and worn, but attached to a brand new leather fob. He walked over to the tarp and pulled the rope. The canvas slid off with a heavy swoosh, revealing the gift. It was his truck, the same beat-up, rusted Silverado he had sold for pennies 2 years ago to pay for my initial physical therapy. But it wasn't rusted anymore. I had spent 6 months tracking it down to a scrapyard in Jersey, where it was waiting to be crushed. I had bought it back and stripped it down to the frame. The body was now painted a deep matte charcoal. The dented bumper was replaced with a reinforced steel bull bar. Under the hood, the dying engine had been swapped for a brand new supercharged V8 that purred like a lion. The torn cloth seats were gone, replaced by custom hand-stitched leather. It was a beast of a machine, a luxury tank. But the VIN number was the same. Lucas stood frozen. He reached out and touched the hood, his fingers tracing the line of the fender, as if checking to see if it was a hallucination. He opened the door and saw the dashboard. I had left the little scratches near the ignition, the ones he made with his keychain years ago. "You found it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't just find it," I said, walking up beside him. "I fixed it, just like you fixed me. It is yours, Lucas, paid in full, no debts, no strings." Lucas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He didn't say anything. He just rested his forehead against the cool metal of the doorframe, and his shoulders began to shake. The tough, stoic man who had stared down our parents and built an empire finally let go. He wept standing there in the driveway of the land we saved, reunited with the sacrifice he made. It was the sound of a burden finally being lifted, washed away by the engine's rumble and a brother's gratitude. The sun was just cresting over the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the surface of the water in shifting shades of gold and violet. It was 6 in the morning, the kind of quiet hour that exists only in places where the air is clean and the world is still asleep. We sat at the end of the refurbished wooden dock, 3 men, 3 fishing rods, and 3 mugs of black coffee steaming in the cool morning air. There was no yacht. There were no waiters in white gloves. There were no desperate social climbers trying to impress each other. It was just us. Dion sat on my left, looking 10 years younger than the man who had stood on that marina dock 6 months ago. The stress lines around his eyes had softened. He had traded his tailored courtroom suits for a thick flannel shirt and jeans. He held his fishing rod with a relaxed grip, watching the bobber dance on the ripples. He had lost a wife, but he had gained his soul back. Lucas sat on my right, leaning back in a canvas chair, his eyes closed, soaking in the first warmth of the sun. He wasn't the director of operations today. He wasn't the man constantly checking inventory or managing staff. He was just my brother. He let out a long, contented sigh, the sound of a man who no longer carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You know," Dion said softly, breaking the silence without disturbing it. "I spent 10 years thinking success sounded like a champagne cork popping. Turns out it sounds like this, just water and wind." Lucas opened one eye and grinned. "Don't get too philosophical, counselor. You are scaring the trout." We all laughed, a genuine, easy sound that drifted out over the lake. It was a laughter born of relief. We had walked through the fire. We had faced the people who were supposed to protect us and found them wanting. We had dismantled their cruelty and built a sanctuary on the ruins of their greed. I shifted in my chair, stretching my right leg out in front of me. The morning dampness used to make the deep ache in my bone unbearable. But today it was just a dull hum. I rolled up the cuff of my cargo pants and looked at the scar. It ran down my shin, a jagged, silvery map of the trauma that had started it all. For a long time I hated this mark. I looked at it and saw rejection. I saw my father choosing a boat over my body. I saw the pain of those nights in the basement. But as I looked at it now under the light of the sun rising over our land, the meaning shifted. It was not a defect, it was a medal. It was the proof that I could break and put myself back together stronger than before. It was the reason Lucas and I were unbreakable. Without this injury, I never would have seen my brother's true heart. Without this scar, we might have stayed trapped in that toxic orbit, begging for crumbs from a table we deserved to own. I rolled the pant leg down and cast my line into the deep, clear water. The reel sang a short, high note. "Grandma would have liked this," Lucas said, watching his own line. "She would have loved it," I replied. "She left this to the family." And finally, for the first time in a long time, that is exactly who is sitting here. We sat there as the sun climbed higher. 3 men bound not just by ink on a contract or blood in our veins, but by the loyalty we had proven when it mattered most. The water was calm. The future was ours. And as I watched the ripples spread out toward the horizon, I realized we had already caught the biggest prize of all. We were free. The most profound lesson from Ethan and Lucas's journey is that family is defined by contribution, not just lineage. We often cling to toxic relationships because of a sense of obligation, believing that shared blood mandates shared loyalty. However, as this story illustrates, true family consists of the people who stand by you when you have nothing to offer but your presence. Richard and Brittany viewed relationships as transactions, valuing assets over human connection, and inevitably they were left with neither. In contrast, Ethan and Lucas built an empire on the foundation of mutual sacrifice and integrity. The narrative also serves as a powerful testament to the alchemy of resilience. Ethan's injury could have been his end, but he used the pain as a blueprint for his future. He stopped waiting for an apology that would never come, and instead constructed a reality where he no longer needed it. It proves that the best revenge is not cruelty, but massive, undeniable success, and the wisdom to walk away. We learn that dignity cannot be bought, only earned, and that sometimes you must sever the roots of the past to let your future bloom. The ultimate victory was not the money, the land, or the yacht. It was the peace of mind found on that quiet dock, surrounded by people who loved them for who they were, not what they could provide. True wealth is the freedom to choose who sits at your table. Share this story if you believe that loyalty is more valuable than gold.